before the first slide, to piggyback on something that Joe said about this is money that we were allocated, budgeted. This is money that we've taxed for. We have this money in our treasurers, in the county treasurers.
It's been collected.
It's been collected. This is also the 301 money that the 1% sales tax has already been collected. So this money is here. It's just, this says we can't spend it. So where did the aggregate expenditure limit come from? Like Mr. Howard said, it's 4 decades ago was placed on all levels of local government via a referral to voters by the legislator. There was a baseline 40 years ago. Established an annual growth factor that the state would look at every single year in March and basically say, this is the capacity in that area that you can spend. Charter schools do not have to worry about this.
What?
So, not a single charter school has to have this conversation. Also, the cities, counties, community college limits can be increased on an individual basis by voters of that jurisdictions. We don't have that option. So it's 4 decades ago. I did some research, and I think it was spurred on about something that happened in California, and this was a reaction 40 years ago that we didn't want it to happen in Arizona, and it has stayed in effect the last 40 years. So I'll pause after every slide. The history is a little blurry. I don't have as many answers, but if there's any questions, please ask. All right, how is it set? It's based on adjusting every year from that 40 years ago. Basically what they do on March 1st is they look at the previous years, or the current year, because it's March of that year, and they look at the 100th day count, and they end up setting what that limit is across the whole state, saying as a state of Arizona, this is the number of students on that 100th day, and then they make that aggregate spending limit on March 1st for the upcoming year. Not too sure about the 1986 approvers approved adding 10%. I think that was it was getting close, and the voters have said, hey, let's increase it by 10%, and the voters were able to not have this happen. That's information. Do you have any information on that, Joe?
Well, I was just going to say back then we were in the bottom 20, not the bottom
Oh,
one.
that's- I
not
was
the
gonna
bottom
say.
one.
This was, we weren't second to last or last funded for education. We were top 25. Federal funds, there are specific funds that this aggregate spending limit does apply to. There are certain ones that it does not apply to. Federal, state funds, cash funds, like Mr. Howard said, are when we rent buildings out, that's a civic fund, are excluded. Also, local approved funds like overrides, bonds, and carry forwards are excluded.
We don't need to worry about that.
Yeah, our override is going to go down by 1/3 next year, which we did attend to last budget cycle last year and said we're keeping all of that 5.1% raise from the 2015 override, and that was part of everyone's raise, and we gave a 4% in September.
Does that limit go up by the cost of living? Or is it just permanently set at a certain number?
It's a formula. They use the 100th day.
It's really complex.
There are certain things, and the reason we're in this position is there are some legislative decisions that have been made that has increased our spending capacity, which may not have been looked at as closely on the impact of the aggregate spending limit, and we'll get into those on the future slides. On that previous slide, it said what was excluded. I'll just tell you what really is included. All of our M&O budget, our main budget, 85% salaries and benefits. All of our DAA, which they've been putting back, and all of what's called the Classroom Site Fund, which is the Prop 301 money that teachers receive, which last budget year we said is 100% teacher compensation. Those are the 3 areas that count against our aggregate spending limit.
And just so you can visualize it, M&O is that whole budget worksheet we just went over.
Yeah.
DAA is not in there, and 301 is not in there.
So piece of the pie in percentage is excluded from this?
You know what, I think you'll see
Okay.
when we get to what our numbers are. And because it shows all of our budget expenditures, what's excluded, what is our applicable expenditures, and what we have to reduce. So really what they look at is M&O, DAA, and that Prop 301 money across the whole state. And it is $7.1 billion. They set last March the aggregate spending limit of $6 million. Now, that left us $1.1 million short. Oh, billion, yeah, I'm sorry, million, that would have been a whole different conversation. That's 1/4 of our allocation. So we're $1.1 billion short, which is a 16.09% reduction to every district's applied expenditure limit, the M&O, DAA, and Prop 301.
We're not short the money, we just can't spend it.
Oh, it's there. It's like, I get my paycheck and it goes in my bank, but I can't spend 16.09%. Because it's unconstitutional. So the three major contributing factors, enrollment counts. This is where I'm unsure about the black and white of the formula, but since they looked at last year's 100th day, PUSD was down 180 students. We got those students back. Well, we got some of them back, which means compared to last 100th day to what we put forward as a proposed budget and that current year funding, we have more spending capacity than what was represented in the 100th day last year. That happened across the whole state. So how much flexibility they had to look and say, these students will come back as we get through COVID and vaccines and boosters. The enrollment count played large into more spending capacity, aggregate spending limits saying you can't spend it.
Yeah, just another way to look at that is COVID hit enrollment, not just across Arizona, across the country. I mean, it's just a fact of life. And that threw this formula off. But we're hearing from folks down at the state that that's the reason, because we didn't get our students back. But I'd call that rhetoric.
That is it. Otherwise, we'd be under the aggregate spending limit. Recent funding additions, we'll get into some of those, but there has been over the last 3 years an increase in funds that we have, including inflation. Every time we apply 2%, that $400,000 that you saw in increased revenue, that's increased spending capacity. So our aggregate limit should go up. So, and then also the big one, and we'll get into a slide, was in 2000, Prop 301 passed, and there was specific language in that passing by the voters that it would not count against the aggregate spending limit. It did sunset, and the legislation did renew it, and did specifically have language that it would count against the aggregate spending limit, and that hit that 1.1 billion. I think on the slide, 800 million of it was solely. This was the first year that 301 counted against the aggregate spending limit, and that was an $800 million increase. So some of the recent decisions which have been good, how much they have been considered with the aggregate spending limit. The 20 by 2020 increased spending $1 billion in over 3 years. Also, special education funding has been looked at. There were tweaks to it just last year, which also in this year's budget increased our spending capacity because they did tweak some of the category. It's the Group B weights, and they also added some funding for gifted, which was never there before. That also increased our spending capacity, and it put us more over the aggregate spending limit.
Imagine if we didn't do that $1 billion for 20 by 2020, we'd be probably more than $20,000 below the national teaching average.
Yep.
I mean, we probably wouldn't have any staff.
Also, the restoration of district additional assistant, that's our capital. When I first took over this position, I think our allocation, they said you can have $1.7 million, but then we're going to take away $1.5 million of it. It actually made me calculate how much the district could have and then have a subtraction of what they're going to take away. We are now pretty much restored with district additional assistance. We're at that 1.7 million mark. Imagine that across the whole state. That is that spending capacity, and that also has hurt us to the tune of 1.1 billion over the aggregate spending limit.
And that brings our DAA back to 2008 numbers,
Yep.
for real.
And once again, the big one, this is the first year the Classroom Site Fund, or 301, is in that new legislative renewal. And I think everything I already said. It's not exempt, and it's $800 million. Thank goodness that they renewed it, because most of it went to teachers, and last year we said it's all going to go to teachers, but now it counts. So, questions? I can go back. Okay. Issues with the limit, we're not the same as 40 years ago. Just in 1979, special education law and IDA were just in its infancies. We have had increases to our K-3 funding. There's a separate Group B line item that brings, I think, $180,000 because K-3 costs more to educate. ELL increased funding. JTED wasn't part back then. So that just as a state increased the amount of spending with JTED districts, or CTED now. Cost of insurance, technology, other requirements outpaced inflation. These are all issues on a 40-year-old formula that they keep applying every March.
When you say, excuse me, I don't want to butt in right now, but.
No, every slide, butt in.
When you say when they, could you repeat the last thing you said? It was too fast for me to process.
Insurance and technology.
Oh,
No.
just about the 40 years ago,
Yeah.
So 40 years ago, the legislatures created the aggregate spending limit.
Okay, so they.
Being
were
legislators.
The state of Arizona.
Yes,
Okay. The state, the legislature.
yeah,
Okay.
and we keep reapplying it every year
Okay.
for the last 40 years. But these are the issues because we're not the same as 40 years ago.
Uh-huh. Yeah, right.
But we were actually funded, now 40 years ago, we were funded about mid-pack in the country. We were doing, that's before we started cutting taxes all the time.
Well, that's the complexity of it. 40 years ago, and you'll see a chart, I think it's from 2010, where the state spending was and where the aggregate limit is and where they crossed. 40 years ago, we were well funded, and it was decisions about cutting taxes in the 80s and the 90s, and it shifted us to the bottom of funding education. And this is the chart. So since 2012, the aggregate spending limit is the blue line. Spending, and once again, that's spending subject to that limit, M&O, DA, and Prop 301, is the orange line. The crossover is this year. The interesting part, if you look, last March they decreased the aggregate spending limit. The bar actually went down. That's where Mr. Howard's enrollment comment comes in. They looked at a year that was not a normal year. They looked at a year of enrollments with a lot of homeschooling, a lot of private schooling, and they decreased it. So we are now at the point, is there a laser?
Yeah, the red.
Oh, you shouldn't have shown me that. This is the aggregate spending limit. This is the state spending capacity. The difference is $1.1 billion. It would be not $1.1 billion if they actually kept it flat, but we still would be under and still be facing, but not at 1.1 billion. Questions on this one? All right. This is our impact. Please ask questions. Every single expenditure on our proposed budget, federal grants, state grants, cash accounts, M&O, DAA, Classroom Site Fund 301, all add up to about $55 million. We have excluded funds, federal funds, state funds, Title I, Special Ed, Title IV, that make up 20 million of that 55 million. We're not capped on that. We have sources that are also excluded, our override, our carry forward, and we do receive tuition from about 5-6 districts that are elementary only or transportation only districts. Those are excluded as well. So so it's 29.9, I think, a million is what we're held to for that aggregate spending limit, which is all of our M&O. It's all of our DAA and it's all of our 301. That's what we budgeted, that's what we taxed for, and that's what we had allocated in the 1% sales tax increase for the 301. So unfortunately, we are held to the 16.09% reduction, which means we need to reduce our spending by 4.8 million.
Well, let me clarify. If the legislature has till March 1st to waive this, if they don't, then we have till April 1st to revise our budget. So that's not a fact right now. That's a threat and a fear right now.
Questions on this slide?
Also, that March 1st date cannot be extended. It's absolutely set in concrete.
They do have options of doing partial waiver, full waiver, percentage waiver, but no action is the 4.8.
Takes a 2/3 vote by the legislature.
It takes a two-thirds vote.
Two-thirds.
Yep.
House and Senate.
But they've done it at least 3 times
Yeah.
that we know of,
Yeah, I knew at least 2008 and 12 of it.
without it being an issue.
Right.
Okay. All right. This is weedy. Okay, so we have 29.9 million that were held M&O DA 301 money. I estimate that about 33.4 of the year will be remaining as of March 1st. Just number of day calculations from March 1st to June 30th. I project, now we are 4 weeks from March 1st, so I took the amount of money we've spent in M&O, DAA, and we did a distribution of 301 money to $2,000 each of the teachers in December. And then I took utilities, the things that I really know we're gonna spend over the next month. And I estimate on March 1st, we will have spent 17.4 million of that 29, which means we have 12.5 million left of the 29 without a reduction. Make it all the way to June 30th. But we have to reduce that 12.5 by 4.8, which is a 38.4% reduction in our spending capacity. We have the money in the bank. We just can't spend 38.4% of it. The math is there, 12.5, spending capacity reduced by 4.8 leaves us with $7.7 million worth of spending that we can out of M&O, DA, and 301. That's the black and white numbers. And how much then do we have, are we planning on spending from March 1st to June 30th? So that's the next slide. Questions on this?
Have they ever done this before?
At least twice, and I didn't even know about it as an administrator because they overrode it without even, I think, advertising it. 2008 and 12, and I think maybe 2007.
Right, because if you do it, if you don't vote for it, I mean, it's not just PUSD, it's going to be the biggest disaster we've ever seen in Arizona education. And if we think 49th in the nation looks bad, I mean, you know, if there were 10 more states, we'd be 59th, but it's, I don't know how, I mean, a lot of superintendents are talking like I am right now. They can't finish sentences about
Yeah.
this.
Just from a magnitude standpoint, 2008, when they did this, the difference between the aggregate and the actual spending capacity was 110 million. This is 10 times worse than that.
What's the, I don't know what word I'm looking for. What's the chatter going on in the state legislature about this? Is there any?
Until the lawsuit in Prop 208 is resolved, they can't talk about it.
They cannot talk
Well,
about it.
that's just what.
Doesn't
They
it-
say they cannot talk about it.
Doesn't it seem, why, who says they can't talk about it?
The legislators.
They do.
Oh, they do. You
The
mean
legislators.
district over here, rule, don't talk about it.
Yeah.
District over here.
The difference between the
don't
other
talk about
times earlier and this time is there's Prop 208, and there are people who are very upset that the voters approved that.
it. Uh-huh.
And there seems to be a chance that if this is held over our head, that maybe Prop 208 will free up. That's the nicest way I can say that.
And the simplest way that I can say is Prop 208 isn't even issued until next year. This is this year. This is a decision that can be made this year, absent of any ramifications of 208. So,
That's
No.
probably why they planned it that way, you think? I mean,
I have no comment.
yeah, okay.
I think the chatter is, let's find ways to ban books. Let's find ways to not teach our children what, or tell our teachers how to teach and what to teach. Let's find ways to subtract more money through vouchers into other private schools. They're ignoring the issue, is what they're doing. Many of them, not all of them, but they're ignoring the issue. They're not doing their job, and there's a political benefit for some of them to do that. And that's why that 2/3 number is so intimidating, because we have to get 2/3 of the legislature to approve this in order for it to not become an issue.
I know it's very elementary, but the Constitution also says that the job of the legislature is to adequately fund schools.
Right.
And I don't hear that coming up right now, but I hear a lot of, but this is constitutional. This was a legislatively created formula that is seemingly imperfect. There seemingly are a lot of problems with it from back in '79.
And charter schools don't have to worry about it.
Right.
What about charter schools?
They
Does
don't
not
have to
affect
worry
charter
about it.
schools.
Does not affect charter schools.
Oh, please, help me, guys.
Okay, go to the next one. Let me talk about March 1st through June 30th expenditures. So our remaining funds after the reduction is 7.7 million. Right now, if we don't hire a single new position or open a new purchase order, because when we open up a purchase order, it encumbers that money, it earmarks it. It's like it's spent until we close that purchase order and then it frees it up. So right now, taking out utilities through March 1st, we have about $12 million worth of encumbered M&O from March 1st to June 30th. Out of that 12 million, 5.8 are salaries and wages.
And benefits?
1.7 benefits.
Okay.
Add those two together, it's about 7.5 million salaries and benefits. That means, you know, the other 3.5 are POs to repair the buildings, to, you know, they're things that are deemed essential. We are so good at spending the minimal. So We do have about 75% of our DAA encumbered. These are things that we have open POs that we are going to get invoices for. And we have $3.8 million worth of Prop 301 encumbered. That is teacher compensation, and I calculate it to be above the 2,000 in December. I believe their payment in June would be $11,000. If all the encumbered money was spent with no additional POs, no additional anything to DAA or M&O, will be $8 million over what we can spend, which will be $8 million over that 7.7 million.
Or $8 million short, is what you're
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, when you're talking about these kind of numbers, I know that the question I'm gonna ask feels like peanuts, certainly, but let's say the expenditure limit, it's waived. How much have we already lost as a district? I know there's no hard and fast number on this, but in terms of your time, Brian, and just all of this planning, but you also mentioned like not opening any POs, not taking any action in terms of hiring right now, or like, have we already been affected financially by this?
I think it's more, I mean, this is something, Mr. Carter, so we need to share. We need our public and staffs, not to scare them, but just to educate, because we do have contact power with our legislators. I think it's been more mental wear and tear. And that's really been kind of at the high level.
Well, you're humble, Brian, but I mean, we spent hours on it today with
I know.
every one of our principals.
I
And,
know.
That's what I mean. I mean,
right,
we're
and
talking about
Brian
this
spent
and-
many hours figuring this stuff out, and
I was actually, during the presentations, Mr. Howard asked me to figure something out, and I worked on it all afternoon, and I still didn't get it where I can present it. But what I am going to do is, we have deemed essential things, and finding out what that magic week will be in which that 7.7 will no longer will be expended. Utilities, fuel for our buses, internet, so our internet, our wide area network, or WAN, food service, custodial service, Prop 301, paying teachers that money. What else am I missing?
Fuel?
Fuel, natural gas, water, the utilities. Anyway, so I am doing it week by week of what those costs are. Week by week, what our payroll plus, we got to remember, for every dollar we pay out, it's about $1.20. That 20 extra percent is Medicaid, Arizona State Retirement System, blah, blah, blah. Also, planning on whatever happens, our health benefits are paid all the way through June 30th. Our employees need health benefits, plain and simple. So I am taking week by week by week by week, and what those costs are, adding it up. I think there's 15 factors, adding up every week, and finding that week when we hit 7.7 million. My guess, and I got down to wages. I got all the utilities and everything done. I got benefits. I just couldn't get through wages. Don't hold me to it. My guess is first or second week of April.
What is the mechanism for them to cut off funding?
well, that enter Tim Carter, and this is why he spoke up to us last week, because he's the guy who has to say to us, you can't spend this money.
Okay.
I mean, that's his point, and he had said to all of us, you should probably start talking with your boards about this, because if it happens, and he said very clearly, I don't want to create a panic, none of us want to create a panic, but he said, at some point, I'm going to have to tell you, you can't spend that money.
So the county
Yes,
Superintendent's
Superintendent.
office controls the money for all the districts in the
Yes.
county.
Yeah.
yes.
primarily.
So everything we do, payroll to vouchers, which are checks, everything that we spend goes through the county every week, payroll every 2 weeks, to the point where if we have a fund, let's say Civic, we're a rental, and we have $10,000 in there, and we do a purchase order for $15,000. They cross-reference the fund, kicks back our voucher, because that fund doesn't have enough money, and we have to figure out, move the expenditure into a different fund. When we hit that 7.7 million, my guess is we won't have payroll or vouchers approved. Nothing will be sent back our way because we have spent our allocation of the bank, the treasurer's office that we can, even though all the money is there.
So if the money is there and funding education is a constitutional law,
Requirement.
is there any way, and this is probably, I mean, this is probably not realistic, but would county superintendents band together and say, we're ignoring you, state legislature, we're spending the money, we're approving the district spending?
They'd be sent to jail.
Yeah,
Seriously. I
Okay,
mean,
yeah,
I
and that's-
was in this meeting with Tim Carter yesterday, and he says he's not willing to go to jail.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what's the matter with Tim, but
I understand. I understand. I'm just wondering where, I know our community needs to push back. The people in the community need to be writing their legislators. They need to be calling them. We need people focused on this issue. But at the highest levels, or at the highest levels countywide, what kind of pushback is being put forward from those individuals? We're a board and we can make it public in the newspaper that we are not happy about this. We can only do as citizens what citizens can do in contacting our legislature. I just hope there are people at higher levels that are willing to take a stand at some point.
I can tell you there's a lot of fear amongst my colleagues that I haven't seen any board meetings like this yet.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fear to speak up. And I can get in later into why those fears are there. There can be repercussions.
our kids have gone through so much in the last 2 years, and they need more right now, not less. And it makes me very angry that our legislature would even consider making this kind of move. I cannot understand how they couldn't justify throwing a whole generation of kids under the bus.
I would just add that from what I'm seeing too, just about the focus of this district leadership team, but also like across our whole state, that it seems seems like even just the consideration is already hurting the progress that we talked about when we talked about ESSER funds and filling the gap and catching up on all that was lost in our community with our teachers, with our students. And now we're talking about food and staffing school through the end of the year. We're not talking about how to catch kids up and get out into the community and just come back. So it's frustrating regardless of what decision is made down the line.
If your goal is to undermine public education, why not go for the knockout punch?
Yeah.
I think Nancy Hudson quoted me on, and I haven't heard anything that says, how can you have already taxed for it? The biggest thing that we are looked at as a public school, this is community schools, is every dollar we spend, we have to do it wisely because this is taxpayer. These are their schools. Misuse of taxpayer money is always on our mind. And we want to be stewards of that money. How on earth can we at the same time have money that's in the bank that we've taxed for and we can't spend it? How is that not misuse of taxpayer money? to the tune of, and once again, it's some of the sales tax. But that $4.8 million, the majority of it is already taxed for. I've already paid my property taxes. And 16.08% of it, as a district, we can't spend by me. How is that not misuse?
Is there any, it makes it sound like there's some evil cabal that has come up with this. Who else would come up with something like this? Who lives here in this state? It's just, it's embarrassing, it's evil.
What, Connie, I think it's that 40-year-old thing. What it is a product of decisions made in the past. It's reanalyzed and looked at every year, and it is adjusted.
Yeah.
What I don't understand, considering this doesn't link to Prop 208, because that isn't impacting this year, is how the first day that the legislature didn't reconvene, call for a vote and have 100% approval of the exemption for this year.
We originally heard from some of the legislative leaders that this would be the first item on the agenda, the first week of the legislative session. It would be taken care of, it'd be off the table, no problem. We're now within a month of that deadline, and
That, we first started talking about it in November, and the first story in the Courier was in November, and one of my colleagues said at the end of the story, I hope this doesn't become political. And it's
become political.
I guess I'm not surprised, though.
Well, I think this is a great opportunity for people in our community to step up and start supporting our schools even more than they already do. Write to your legislators, write to the
Call
state
them.
superintendent, write to the governor. Get your voices out there, I think.
We talked already a little bit about the annual timeline. The previous March before school year starts, they look at that 100th day, they look at spending, they set the aggregate spending limit. By November 1st, they know how many students have showed up. They do a projection of the 100th day. They project what that ultimate spending capacity is by all the districts across the state. If they project the spending capacity is above the aggregate limit, they have on November 1st to put out a report. It's called a Budge Ag, something like that. And then they have the opportunity, when they reconvene as the first of the year, to do an exclusion. And they have until March 1st with a 2/3, like Mr. Howard said. If it doesn't pass, we have up until April 1st to take our adopted budget back in July and reduce it down by that the 16.09%. That's budget dollars. What I'm doing with those calculations with the salaries and the benefits and utilities, it's the actual spending impact, but we would have to take our budget down by 4.8 million.
So we're not talking about solutions tonight, but we're talking about them all the time in the background. And if we get to that point, we will be. Prior to that point, of course, we'll keep the board in the loop and the public in the loop as much as possible. But we may need to have a special meeting to sit and talk about what our options are around and what that drop dead date is and how we handle that.
If as Andy pointed out, it's time that our community's gonna have to step up and help us. And, okay, how can I say this? If, let's say that somebody in our community, let's say somebody who's, and you can't help but think it's gonna be a politician who's gonna help, or who's gonna pull people together to to and try to explain, you know, the math is tough to understand, but the concept is this.
Yeah.
You know, you don't want to get into the, you know, the history and all that. Well, maybe you could, but, if somebody who can pull people together, how do you think the community would react? Has anything like this ever happened before? Well, you said it a couple times.
Not on the
Not at
radar
this
because it
magnitude.
was,
Not of this magnitude,
it was done.
I
Yeah.
understand, but,
it was done.
It was
They voted,
fixed before.
it was excluded. They reanalyzed the aggregate spending limit the next year, and it never crossed on a graph like that.
okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think this is a big step right here. These leaders right here, our school board, talking about this issue, and, you know, at least exposing what it is and not creating a panic. But we also have some teachers in the crowd, and,
Yeah.
and I know that some of their colleagues and them have been talking about how they can share how it affects them. And there's a newspaper article over the weekend, and some of them are angry that they have to deal with this right now. It's been
I-
a tough couple of years.
Yeah. I don't care if you are a school board member, you're a teacher, you're a parent of a student, whatever. Every community in this state and every person in every community in this state would be affected if this is not taken care of. This is not just an education issue. It will have serious impacts across the board. So, you know, just because you don't have kids in school or because you're not on the school board or whatever, don't think it isn't going to affect you.
You know, for me, it's a moral too. You know, I think about our kids, the impact, but
Yeah.
also the lesson. You know, if you have a student who does chores, earns $100, and yet you're going to say, well, you can only spend $84 of it. And it's not because we want you to save for later. It's just we're going to keep that in a box that you can never open ever, never get back.
Yeah.
What would a kid say to that? That's not fair. How is this?
And I think, to follow on Deb's comment, there's such great interest in our community right now for education. I mean, on all levels, on all sides. Like you said, this affects everybody. Parents need to understand, no matter what your beliefs are politically, that there's a potential that this is going to keep your kids out of school or significantly impact their educational experience. We need to be speaking up.
I have news for you, too. If we have a bunch of teachers leave, that's not going to be immediately fixed.
Right.
Yeah, and it's not just an if this happens, it impacts us. It's already impacting us. Holding hostage education in this form, we've already seen the impact. We already have reason to be frustrated with this, regardless of future decisions. Certainly, it can get 10 times worse, or more than 10 times worse. But I think it should be clear to everybody in this community that we've already been impacted by this in a negative way.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, in my almost 30-year career, we've seen a lot of attacks on public education in Arizona from the legislature, and this is huge. And so, I guess if I'm going to stop talking and wrap it up and say, if it happens, it's going to create such chaos that there will be change, and it will be good change. But if you take 49 and just blow it up for even a quarter or whatever it is, 49th in the nation, and just blow it up, then you're going to get some attention from some people. And they're, you know, so I guess there's threats on both sides, but that's my thought, is that I hope people are getting tired of this battle we're fighting just to get our kids paid at number 49 in the nation. I hope people are getting tired of it.
I was going to say something in that too.
I
I
better
don't
stop.
think And as Joe said earlier, we aren't going to reach any solutions tonight, but we need to be aware of what's going on. We need the community to be aware of what's going on, and I think we probably can move on with our agenda at this point. But we have not heard the last of this.
And can I add one thing?
Brian?
This is videotaped. So please, if you're watching, thank you PA for being here. It'll be posted on our website. Share this so that people can hear this discussion and know the black and white of the numbers. We don't have solutions,
Yes.
but this is the reality of where we're at.
Deb, can I do a segue?
Yes.
As Kelly Bradstreet would say, can we talk about curriculum now?
All right.